Hi, my name is Kristen Chrisman, and I've been reading essays about the Ukraine crisis, and things are getting extremely dangerous. I'm very tired of it all. We've had enough. U.S. leaders have got to grow up, and so I'm going to cut to the chase and skip over several essays that I was going to do. What I'd like to show you is in the next 5 videos, which will be my grand finale, I'll show the paradigm for peace model that I created the autumn of 9/11, how I apply it to the Ukraine crisis. Now, I've done that a little bit in some of the essays, but not completely at all, just a little bit. So the paradigm for peace model has 4 parts to it. The first part is looking at the roots of violence, and we look at the defensive roots of violence and the aggressive roots of violence on both sides of conflict. So defensive roots of violence means when you're using violence to defend something that's legitimately yours, like your life or your house. An aggressive root of violence would be if you're being violent in order to seize something that belongs to somebody else. Now, throughout the entire model, there's overlap and things can be fuzzy. So I might feel that I'm being violent in defense, but someone else might think I'm being aggressive. There can be disputes about what's legitimate, what's not legitimate, okay? And even in the one person's mind, they can have a mix of defensive and aggressive roots of violence in their mind. So it's not necessary to pinpoint it down. The point of the model in these categories is just to make sure we cover everything. And with defensive and aggressive, it's just important not to pinpoint who's acting for what motivation, but to make sure that we have a U.S. foreign policy that covers all these things. Because then we can, it's like a nice big fish net that can catch everything. So, roots of violence, the first element of the paradigm for peace model. The second element is we look at the escalators of violence. Mental, legal, and physical escalators of violence. I define these as factors that make it more likely a person will choose violence in order to satisfy their defensive fears or their aggressive desires. Because, for example, just because I'm fearing that somebody's going to seize my home doesn't mean I'll use violence. But if I have a gun in my hand already, a physical escalator of violence, I might be more likely to use the gun. Maybe not. I'm just saying that could be a physical escalator of violence. A mental escalator of violence is if I was raised to believe always, defend yourself physically. Those are just examples of escalators of violence. And then the third component is the 3 facets of solutions, which correspond to the mental, legal, physical escalators. We have mental, legal, physical tools. So I call them, in fact, I have a poster here from long ago, from 2009. These are the 3 facets. The first facet up here is the first facet of mental tools of human development. And I'll talk about this in another video. The second facet of legal tools of justice. And the third facet of physical tools, which can be violent or non-violent, of physical control. So that's the third element of the paradigm for peace model. And then the fourth element, which is really the foundation of it, is a cooperative attitude of thought and dialogue. I call this a quest attitude. Cooperative quest attitude, both of thought, like when I'm working on this, on my project, I try to keep that cooperative thought in my head, a way of thinking, and cooperative dialogue. And it's dialogue that's emphasized, not debate. Debate could mean different things to different people in different cultures, but the way I see it in this culture, I see debate as verbal war. It's just antagonistic. The idea that winning is beating the other side. To get away from physical war, we need to get away from verbal war. And we need to get away from the idea that winning is beating the other side. So in dialogue, there's 2 goals. Augmenting truth, because you're trying to be open and genuine and learn from each other and teach each other. And friendship and harmony. You try to come away better friends, or at least with better understanding, better respect from the dialogue. And I really think we need to have that tradition in our culture if it's not too late. So what we'll do in this video is talk about the defensive roots of violence. In the next video I'll do the aggressive roots of violence. The next video will be the escalators of violence, and then the fourth video I'll talk about 3 facets of solutions, and then the final 5th video will be, see, I have all these charts I made of the different roots of violence, and I'm going to put them on this big poster. I don't even know that you can see it, or if it was even worth doing this, because I don't know that you can see it, but I'll put them onto this chart, and then in the 5th video I'll show you the chart all together. But just so you see the chart, first of all, this is a chart for the, wait a minute, let me turn it around. This is for the defensive roots of violence. So my Paradigm for Peace model has 7 categories, but I'm just going to do 5 for the purposes of this analysis. The first 5. I hope you can see this. This says life and safety. So, defensively speaking, how are people feeling threatened? How are their lives and safety feeling threatened, which is causing them to commit violence? Power and freedom is the second category. How are people feeling that their power, their freedom are threatened, which is causing them to commit violence? Third category, wealth, land, and possessions. How are they threatened? Fourth category, values and identity. And the 5th category, love, worth, and friendship. Now, these 2 are especially not talked about. But frankly, in this crisis, none of these are talked about. I mean, Putin has been talking about major threats to life that Russia feels, and that some Ukrainians feel. And the U.S. policymakers and media makers are just trivializing it. So they're not even paying attention to these threats, the most basic threats. But you never hear people talking about, oh, how do your values feel threatened? Or how does your sense of worth feel threatened? But that's really, really important, because you'll find people will kill each other when they feel put down. And then in the chart, the top half is all about how Russia, Putin, and allied Ukrainians feel threatened. And the bottom half is how U.S., NATO, and allied Ukrainians feel threatened. Notice, it's not Russia versus Ukraine. It's Russia and allied Ukrainians versus the U.S., NATO, and allied Ukrainians. Okay, so I'm going to set a little timer to help me not run overboard, because I don't have a script written out. So I'm going to use a timer to try not to go overboard before my camera shuts off. So first we'll talk about defensive roots of violence. And this card is how Russia, Putin, and allied Ukrainians feel that that life and safety are threatened. So I don't know that you can read this, but I'll hold it up for you for a minute. Top says NATO missiles. That's a major thing. In Poland, in Romania, possibly next in Ukraine, in the Black Sea. I did a few essays in part 2 about threats to life. So we already talked about this in detail. I'll be very brief. But major threat to life. The next is, oh, I have a quote here, knife at our throat. Putin says that in one of his speeches. It feels like a knife to our throat. Some of them, he talks about how far away the missiles are. One can arrive in Moscow in 5 minutes. I mean, it's ridiculous how close they are. Think of how berserk U.S. policymakers went with the Cuban Missile Crisis when the Soviet Union was going to put missiles in Cuba. You know, Kennedy and staff thought that was too close. And then, what's the U.S. reaction to Russian fears? Trust us. They just say, trust us. What kind of security arrangement is that? The U.S. would never be satisfied with that if Russia said to us, oh, just trust us. What the U.S. should be doing, of course, is dismantling some of these missiles. Another big cause of threats to life and safety is the Civil War violence. That is also trivialized by U.S. policymakers. U.S. policy and media makers always frame conflicts so that it looks like the bad guy, the enemy, is the one who started it. So Russia invaded Ukraine in February. They started it. That's how we're supposed to perceive it. But that's not how it started. It started at least as far back as the U.S.-supported coup in Ukraine of 2014, and then the Civil War, which the U.S. Pumped weapons into. Since 2014, I write down here, 14,000 have been killed. So some people are under the impression that, oh, how could Russia do this, invade a peaceful democratic nation like Ukraine? It was not a peaceful democratic nation. It was plagued by war. And I write here, NATO and U.S. have armed Ukraine for years. The U.S. with direct commercial sales, like from the weapon industry itself selling to Ukraine. But those sales have to be approved, and were approved by the Department of State in consultation with Defense. And then beginning in 2017, under Trump, the U.S. government began selling weapons to Ukraine during the Civil War, pumping the Civil War. Basically, the U.S. was at war already. I have another, down here I say, Odessa, burning alive. Putin mentions that in one of his speeches, how I think about 200 people, Ukrainians, were injured, maybe about 50 were killed. I'll mention it later and get the numbers. But this is dismissed. Putin says nobody has looked into this. Nobody's punishing the people who did this, because it was a pro-Russian Ukrainian peaceful protest against the Kiev government. And these people were trapped in a building and burned alive. And also Putin says nuns, monks, and priests have been attacked. And again, it's not just Putin who says this. You can look online. It's on the Orthodox Church websites. They've been attacked by ultranationalists, including neo-Nazis. Nazi graffiti has been put on the Orthodox churches there. It's a very extremely pro-Ukraine nationalist right-wing movement that is vandalizing and physically assaulting people at the Orthodox Church. Okay, good. I kept under my limit. Now, next we talk, well, the point is, when we do the Paradigm for Peace model, what you've got to do in cooperative dialogue is listen to the fears. So, Biden, or whoever he wants to send, because I don't know that he's capable of doing this, should talk to Putin, or whoever he wants to send, or whatever group, and listen to the Russians' fears. Really listen to them as a friend and say, oh my God, I can really get in your shoes. I can see how scary that must be, having missiles right there in Poland, right there in Romania. The Civil War violence. Wow, I can really, yeah, you must be enraged that all these thousands of people are dying. We've got to get into the shoes of the Russians and the allied Ukrainians. And now, the next step is we get in the shoes of the U.S. policymakers and feel their fears. I admit, just as some people have a hard time getting into the shoes of the Russian side, I have a very hard time getting into the shoes of these U.S. policymakers. So I'll warn you that ahead of time, but I'll try. So they have fear of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Frankly, I think there's certain U.S. policymakers who know exactly what's going on, and they're not afraid of Russia's invasion. I think they've provoked it deliberately. But there are certainly many U.S. policymakers who have swallowed all this, and many, many Americans who have swallowed the propaganda, who are afraid that Russia invaded Ukraine, and they're afraid that Russia's going to do more because of all the propaganda. So you have to listen to those fears, because whether the fears are rational or irrational, you should listen to them and try to get in their shoes. And then if you think they're irrational, then talk about why. But you don't just do what the U.S. media is doing to Putin and say, neo-Nazis. There aren't any neo-Nazis in Ukraine. How stupid. First of all, there are. But even if there weren't, that's not the way to talk to somebody if they have fears. So other U.S. fears include, we have to take into account the Cold War fears. I'll hold this up close for a little bit. Cold War fears. There was a big Cold War fear for decades that, oh, the Soviet Union is going to invade Western Europe, and oh, the Soviets are behind every single reform movement worldwide. You know, the tentacles of Moscow are behind everything. And that really was in people's heads, like the Dulles brothers, John Foster Dulles, Secretary of State under Eisenhower, and Allen Dulles, his brother, CIA director. They really thought this. It turned out to not be true. But those are fears, and we have to address those fears and say why they weren't true or why some of them were true. Again, civil war violence from the other side is a fear. And lastly I have, Russia's alleged invasion of Crimea. Now, frankly, I don't know if Russia invaded Crimea or not. How can I tell? But I would definitely not say, they definitely did. Russia says they didn't. U.S. policymakers say they did. All I know is U.S. policymakers are lying through their teeth about a lot that I can definitely say is a lie. Like when they say Putin said this or Putin wrote this, and he clearly did not. So my understanding with Crimea is that after the U.S. supported this coup and put their pro-NATO guy into power in Kiev, that then the U.S. had a puppet, and then the U.S. or NATO was going to be able to get a base, a military base on the Black Sea. And that's what Russia, no way, you can't have a military base on the Black Sea. That's right on their border. And that's why Russia had to have Crimea. And my understanding is there was a referendum. And the fact is, I think about 90% of the people there speak Russian and not Ukrainian, and they are Russian, and I believe they did want to be part of Russia. And they had been part of Russia until 1954. I don't know why Khrushchev transferred it over to Ukraine. It's not clear why. But that's something still to talk about and not just deny the fear, but talk about it. I'm trying to do 5 minutes on each chart. So then on our big chart here, we've talked about how Russia, Putin, and allied Ukrainians feel fear to life and safety. And we've talked about how the U.S., NATO, and allied Ukrainians feel fear to life and safety. So then we look at power and freedom. Now again, I'm doing this very briefly because things are really serious and I don't know if we have time for an essay for each topic. So, power and freedom. How does Russia, Putin, and allied Ukrainians feel that their power and freedom are threatened? And a big way was in that U.S.-supported 2014 coup in Ukraine, which I've talked about in some of the earlier essays. And I write here that it was undemocratic completely. It was a violation of sovereignty. U.S. and policy makers continually talk about Russia's lack of respect for Ukraine's sovereignty. This was a major violation of Ukraine's sovereignty. Had the U.S. not violated Ukraine's sovereignty in 2014, Russia would not have to violate Ukraine's sovereignty now with the invasion, because the coup started it all, and Putin says that too. And I felt that myself even before I read what Putin said. So it was undemocratic, violation of sovereignty. It was not done for Ukrainians. Putin says the same thing. And I say the same thing because of my 21 years of research of U.S. foreign policy and seeing what there's maybe about 50 national leaders that the CIA has killed around the world over the past 50 plus years. And after these coups, the people are worse off. I mean, there's a certain elite that's better off because they're in league with certain elite in the U.S. that's better off because of the government business deals that are made. But for the ordinary people and for the poor, the middle class and poor, all those ordinary people, things are worse off. And the protests were hijacked by ultranationalists. That's what many sources say this. Putin says this, and this is what I think too. Putin himself says that the protests, the Euromaidan protests of 2014, had legitimate reasons behind them, like the corruption of the government. Putin's not against that, but they were hijacked. The peaceful protests were hijacked by violent ultranationalists, and there's suspicions that the U.S. was behind this. You know, I talk in another essay about how Biden's Undersecretary of State, Victoria Nuland, was caught on a phone conversation with the U.S. Ambassador Jeffrey Pyatt, discussing who the next Ukrainian leader would be, who they wanted to get in there. And the Yanukovych wasn't even ousted yet. It was in the middle of the protest. Just evidence seems to show that they were engineering this. So that's a big... Oh, I forgot to set my timer so that I don't go overboard. But multiple CIA and NED coups. NED is the National Endowment for Democracy. Russia has to fear. And it's not just coups, it's political and economic turmoil that they instigate, the CIA and NED, labor unrest, protests, character assassination with the help of control of the media, as they've done to Putin. And then this often leads to the coup. A potential coup in Russia, I have written down, is a major fear, I would think, that Putin has and that Russians have, and that I have. Because you see, the US media is constantly picking on Putin and trying to almost like sever him from the Russian people, trying to make it sound like he's unhinged and crazy, which he's not. I think he has a very intelligent mind. U.S. denying validity of referendums. That's another point I have here. Because Zaporozhye and Kherson regions, in between the Crimea and Donetsk and Lugansk, there's a couple other regions that are having referendums to decide whether to unite with Russia or not. And the U.S. media is just right off the bat saying, oh, they're false, they're bogus. So they're not even going to recognize them. These referendums might very well be valid. So that's a threat to freedom, that here they are having referendums and the U.S. is not going to honor them. Another threat, NATO domination. We have that under fears of to life, threats to life, but it's also a threat to power. And then this U.S.-led rules-based order, which I talked about in a recent essay, and the unipolar world. This is the idea that the U.S. policymakers think that they should be setting the rules for the world. And they really think that they're the good guys and they know how to do it. So, again, in cooperative dialogue, Americans should be listening and spending time, much more time than I just did, really getting into the shoes of the Russians, Putin, and their allied Ukrainians to feel these fears and empathize with them. That's the first step. Listening and empathy. Then we look at U.S. fears. How are power and freedom threatened for the U.S., for NATO, and for allied Ukrainians? I have down here, Putin allegedly subverting democracy in Europe, U.S., and worldwide. Putin's alleged imperial goals in Crimea, Donetsk, and Lugansk. Putin's alleged goal to dissolve the Ukraine. Russian pawns, I put that in quotes, in power in Donetsk, Lugansk, and Crimea. That's how U.S. policymakers see this, and probably many Americans, since they might be brainwashed. Lack of representation. I put that in there for the sake of the internal conflict within Ukraine, because the ultranationalists, including the neo-Nazis, have this, I think, grievances that they're not represented enough, or just Ukrainians in general aren't represented enough. In fact, they're angry about Jewish people being represented too much. So, as I said in my essays on life and safety, part 2, it's really important to also listen to the ultranationalists and neo-Nazis. You don't shut your ears to anybody. You have to find out, what are they fearing? What are their complaints? As awful it might seem to listen to a neo-Nazi, it's really important to hear what their fears are. Same that some people might think it's awful to listen to Putin. I don't, but some people do. You've got to, what are his fears? Same with U.S. policymakers. To me, that's awful, because I just don't believe them, and I don't like them. But it's really important to listen. What are their fears? Because it's not just greed driving the U.S. There really are fears. Okay, so we've got to listen to everybody's fears. Then, a fear is, if the U.S. doesn't set the rules, others will allegedly set the rules in a bad way. And that's stated by certain top U.S. policymakers and authors, certainly by Project for a New American Century, the neoconservative group, but also by certain liberal interventionists and liberal hawks. and the idea that Russia will allegedly fill any vacuum of power. And that was said, I believe, by a PNAC member, Schmidt. But that's part of why I think we've got to expand NATO across Europe, because if we don't, Russia's going to come back. Okay, instead of just mocking that, I mean, it does seem ridiculous to me, but instead of just mocking it, as the U.S. mocks Putin, why do they think that? What's their evidence? Okay, what would make them feel better? What would make these Americans feel safe that it's not going to happen in a way that doesn't involve NATO having to go into Slavic lands? Is there some other way we can make them feel safe that Russia's not going to be going that way? Okay, then we go to the category, the next category, the third one, wealth, land, and possessions. That's a big one. I'll set my timer for, whoop. Okay, so how do Russia, Putin, and their allied Ukrainians feel threatened? There's my chart, and you know, this time I don't have something written out to put on countercurrents.org, but I'll type up a transcript of what I'm saying and of these charts and I'll send that into countercurrents. So hopefully that can be posted, because it's probably hard to read this. But the first is loss of energy market. Pipelines being shut down. You know, the U.S. policymakers were trying to shut down Nord Stream 2 even before it was built. They're saying now, oh, this is a punishment for what Russia did. But they wanted to shut it down long ago. They're just using the Russian invasion of Ukraine as a pretext. They've been wanting to shut down Nord Stream 2. Why? To push Russia out of the energy market. Okay, so this is a fear Russia has, being pushed out of the energy market, which way back John D. Rockefeller was trying to do, but he lied about, he spread rumors about the safety of Russian oil. A fear of U.S. LNG being pushed, liquefied natural gas. Again, it's being framed by U.S. policymakers that, oh, Texas and Louisiana, LNG industry, we're going to rescue Europe. Because Europe, poor thing, is dependent upon Russia, the big bad wolf. We'll save you. But they're so happy. They want to sell LNG. You know, Trump wanted to for his energy secretary, Rick Perry, former Texan governor. It's money for them, okay? So this is a threat to Russia. U.S. rival pipelines. And in one of my earlier essays, I talked about Georgia. How the U.S. reportedly was involved in that coup in Georgia because they wanted their pipeline deals to go through and not Russia's. And sure enough, after the coup, the arrangements with Russia were cut off. So other fears. Loss of fossil fuel access to the Black Sea and to the Caspian Sea. To me, it's just common sense that the U.S. fossil fuel companies don't belong over there and around the Black Sea. They don't belong around the Caspian Sea. That's Russia's turf, okay, and the countries around there. But there's a fear. Here, the U.S. is trying to take, covertly, the U.S. is taking over Ukraine. It has, with that coup. Behind the scenes, it has its puppet in there. So it has control over the Black Sea and the rich fossil fuel deposits there. Same with Georgia. It's trying to get control of keep control of the pipelines from the Caspian Sea. Other fears: sanctions, frozen assets. Abusive foreign investment in Ukraine and in Russia. Now, I don't have proof of this abusive foreign investment. But Putin, in his speech, says, or in his essay, or both, that the U.S. and Western policymakers and businesses have been trying to take over Ukrainian businesses, that they might be interested in agricultural land there for their own benefit, not to help Ukraine. They frame it that way, but for their own profits. And certainly this happened when the Soviet Union dissolved, and then Yeltsin became president of Russia in the 1990s, and Russia is said to have been cannibalized by greedy Russian oligarchs, but also Westerners, trying to make money off of Russian backs by taking resources that once belonged to all of Russia. So this is a big fear of Russia, and that is just, it's not even denied, it's not talked about, it's neglected. by the U.S. media. They don't approach that area. And that's something that really should be discussed publicly. What's going on? What kind of foreign investment is going on? And last of all, I have written down here, corruption. Fear of corruption, because certainly the Ukrainian government right now is accused of being very corrupt, and that the weapon deals from the U.S. are said to be corrupt also, bringing money into certain Ukrainians. Okay, I'm sticking to the time limit, I think. Next, we look at the same category, wealth, land, and possessions, from the U.S., NATO, and their allied Ukrainians' point of view. So there's that sheet. And the first thing I have written is, loss of potential profit. See, I think with regard to this category, the U.S. NATO role is much more aggressive, which we'll talk about in the next video. But if we try to look at it from their point of view, like defensively, then you can see it as like, well, a loss of potential profit in Europe's energy market. It's actually more aggressive. We're aggressively trying to get that energy market, because it's something they don't have yet. But they're probably seeing it as, a loss of a potential profit that we could be getting. So we're being threatened, like our future is threatened. So, loss of potential profit in Europe's energy market, in Black and Caspian Sea fossil fuels, in investments in Ukraine and Russia, in Arctic trade and fossil fuels, and these are things I've talked about in other essays. In Russia's renationalized energy, defense, and banking sectors. That's another reason I think U.S. policy and media makers don't like Putin, because he renationalized the banking, energy, and defense sectors, which cut down on the amount of profit Americans could make. Dollar hegemony is very important. I don't know a lot about it. I've tried to read about it. All I know is if the dollar is the currency being used in trade, it gives the U.S. more power. And if the dollar is the currency being used in the energy trade, it's extremely important to the U.S. And the U.S. wants to maintain that dollar hegemony, especially in the energy market. And I think that's another reason they want to get Russia out of the energy market in Europe, in order to keep the dollar as the top dollar, as the top currency. But they see that again as in a defensive way. We're being threatened. And then corruption here also, because some of the Ukrainians who were for the coup, or who maybe weren't for the coup but were for the protests against Yanukovych, were angered by his corruption. The next category is values and identity. Now, this is a really important category with regard to the Mideast 9/11 conflict. And I write about this a lot in my unpublished works. I probably mentioned them, I've mentioned them before. I've worked for 21 years on a multi-volume series about foreign policy and peace, in which I applied this model to the Mideast U.S. conflicts. But no publisher has had the courtesy of publishing it. And I tried, more than 10 years ago. I've tried again recently. So a lot of my ideas are coming out in these videos, including the entire model. So this was really important in the Mideast conflict. It's not as important in what's going on right now, but it is important. So I'll read it. Fears of spread of unpleasant parts of U.S. culture and values. The extremes. Putin talks about excessive permissiveness in Russia. Or as I talk about in essay, I think it's 4J, with regard to the gay, lesbian, queer, that entire movement, Putin says that all those people are welcome, let them be happy. But he says he thinks the West goes to an extreme, say in how like a kindergartner has 6 gender roles to choose from. But they don't like the extremes, and they also like to shield the youth more from public exposure to talk about all this. So that's just one example. But the U.S., as we'll talk about later, is very intent on expanding its culture around the world. So that is a threat. Also a threat from U.S. commercialization and homogenization. It's not talked about a lot, though, in Putin's speeches at all. Here's one that's talked about. Attacks by ultranationalists and neo-Nazis on the Orthodox Church people and buildings. And I mentioned that already, on the monks, priests, the nun who was kicked in the stomach. Very abusive. And that's an attack on their culture and their values, because the Russian Orthodox Church has traditionally been very bound with the church in Ukraine. But with this whole Western pushed shift, pushing Russia away from Ukraine, militarily, economically, politically, and culturally, linguistically, and spiritually, separating the religions is part of it too. Then legal attacks on Russian language and literature. By legal attacks, I mean attacks within the laws of Ukraine, where teaching Russian has been dropped from the curriculum. Even Tolstoy's War and Peace now is banned from the school curriculum. I write about that in a recent essay, Part 4S. And then there's even, as I mentioned in that essay, a draft law for English to become Ukraine's international language. So there's a push for English to become more important than Russian. And again, it's a part of pushing Russia away from Ukraine and bringing Ukraine into the U.S. NATO orbit. So those are all threats to values and identity. Then we look at fears on the U.S., NATO, and their allied Ukrainian side. And I'll hold it up. And it's kind of a mirror image of some of the things I said. Russia's legal attacks, like attacks in law on the Ukrainian language. There's complaints that Ukrainians no longer being taught as much in Crimea, Donetsk, and Lugansk, which actually makes sense because they're more Russian areas. But there's a feeling of intimidation that people who want to learn Ukrainian more are afraid to even ask. Then there's Putin's alleged cultural homogenization in Russia. I mentioned that in the essay for us, where supposedly he's pushing Russian more than minority languages. But keep in mind, I think there's 35 official languages in Russia, which says a lot. It's not all homogenized like in the USA. And then lastly, there's a fear of Putin's alleged attack on civilization and democratic values, because this whole attack on Ukraine is being painted that way, as if it's decency against the barbarians. I think that's wrong and it's propaganda, but it's a fear that we should talk about. And like, what are people's worst fears? What are they imagining happening? Why? And then what would make them feel better? What would reassure them? Does it have to be a war that destroys Russia that would make them feel better? Or is it something less than that that can be done to make them feel better? And then the last category that we'll talk about is love, friendship, and worth. This is very, very important in this conflict, and it's being totally trivialized by the U.S., and I talk about this in the last essay for S. Fears of anti-Russia attitudes deliberately instigated by post-coup Ukrainian government, and even prior to the 2014 coup by Western powers. And Putin writes in his speech how he remembers, even prior to the coup, that Western powers, I'm assuming primarily the U.S., was pushing Ukraine to sever its relationships with Russia, like its economic relationships for starters. And like it wouldn't allow Ukraine to have relationships with both Russia and Europe. It wanted the relationship just with Europe. Loss of social, emotional, cultural, and spiritual ties with Ukraine. And Putin writes about this at length in his essay and his speeches, and this is totally twisted by the U.S. media mainstream media, and perhaps more than the mainstream media, that says that, oh, Putin wants Ukrainians to be Russians. He doesn't believe in Ukraine's sovereignty. When he says unity, he means there are no national borders. He's not talking about national borders. He's talking about these ties that Ukrainians are actually being taught to hate Russia and to fear Russia. And it's very painful. And then last of all, I've written down here the anti-Russian hatred and prejudice in the U.S., during the Cold War, in the U.S. media, news, and in U.S. TV shows. Like often TV shows, like growing up in the 70s, and movies, and the Russians are the bad guys, and they're depicted in a very bad way, in an inaccurate way, and that's very hurtful. So it's important to take the time to talk about these things. Biden could do this when he wakes up today. He could call Putin on the phone and say, you know, let's talk about this. This is really important. Okay? But he's not going to do that. He doesn't have the brain power to do that, or the heart. And there too, there's also a very bad presidential precedent, where presidents are always, the ones rated as great are the ones who've got more territory for the United States. It's ridiculous. Last of all, fears about love, friendship, and worth being threatened from the point of view of the U.S., NATO, and their allied Ukrainians. Frankly, I don't know what they are. I don't see evidence of this at all. But my guess is, though, that there's a possible deep down fear of a lack of popularity and friendship internationally amongst U.S. policymakers. So, there's an imposition of U.S. power and culture on others. In other words, you will like me. This is something I've suspected for a while over the years when I study U.S. foreign policy, that it almost seems like the U.S. is like forcing itself upon somebody, like you love me, you know, instead of being nice and having somebody love you because you're nice to them and care about them, it's like imposing yourself on them. And the only evidence I've seen of somebody actually saying this is when something President Eisenhower said, where he was like, well, why can't we get these people to like us, he said, about some foreign countries. So I don't know if that's driving people, and if U.S. policymakers actually have some very bad social skills at making friends, and so they push for this domination instead, domination of military, political power, economic power, and cultural systems, and cultures onto other nations. So that concludes the 5 categories that will go into this chart, and tonight I'll tape them on here. Like this will go here, and then the one for the U.S. will go down here, and then this will go over here. Okay, and I'll show it to you later when it's all put together. And then in the next video we'll do this side. We'll talk about aggressive roots of violence. I think. So we went through those, but I really I can't imagine the U.S. policymakers ever doing this. So I think what we've got to do is try to get some of us to have these cooperative dialogues, even if we can role play, pretend we're different people from different nations representing different fears, and talk about it. And maybe somebody in the U.S. government's willing to talk with somebody in Russia about this. I don't know, or even theater groups from different countries, if they could put on a play where they actually talk about this and do an ideal cooperative dialogue where they're really empathizing with each other's fears, whether they're rational or irrational. But let me just look at this to make sure I told you everything I wanted to in this video. Oh, I really want to thank you again. Thank you again, those who commented. Again, I got a nice email today. Really nice, and also it's really special when people are commenting from other countries. I mean, it's great. People from this country from the United States are commenting, because it's really nice to know other Americans feel the same way. It's a great feeling. But it's really nice when I get a comment from Russia or from Scotland, or today from Ghana, a person from Ghana. And it's, I really, really appreciate it. And from a member of the Riverside Church in New York. So what I'm hoping, if you liked any of these ideas, if you could please, because things are very dangerous, please send either the ideas or the link to the video or the link to the YouTube channel or the comic cards to like 10 people and ask those 10 people to send it to 10 people. Or if you want to modify the ideas, you know, write in how, to your friends, how you would modify things or improve upon them. But we're up against the New York Times propaganda machine. It's awful. We're up against the CIA propaganda machine. We're up against these U.S. policymakers who think in a very different mindset. They're just in the power of their fearful prejudices and their aggression, their faith in, their abnormal faith in weapons. And they're out of control, and they're being totally irresponsible. We should not be having nightmares worrying about World War III. You know, we shouldn't be in this fear that we're all in around the world. It's ridiculous that our leadership has put us in this position of threatening Russia to this point, when it's been so clear for so long that the U.S. and NATO were going way too far, and that these weapon shipments are utterly stupid. So, and again, I normally don't ask you, but if you want to, you can subscribe. And as my son showed me, there's a little notification bell you can click on, and that will let you know when I have another video. After I do the grand finale here of these 5 videos, I'm not sure if I'll be doing any more essays or not, or if I'll just focus on trying to get the ideas heard elsewhere, or try to get my books published, or just prepare for nuclear winter. I'm not sure, but thank you very much, and I really appreciate you taking the time to listen. And the next video will be on aggressive roots of violence. Thank you very, very much. Take care.